Well, it is absolute chaos here for workers in Paris. 11 of the city's 16 metro lines are not operating today. Most metro stations, like this one behind me, are closed and shuttered. And we're going to see big demonstrations later in the day. And shops and businesses along the routes of the protests are mostly shuttered. Banks have put up wooden screens to try to save their windows and cash dispensers from being smashed, as they have often been during the Yellow Vest protests, and thousands of police are being deployed in the French capital because of fears that Yellow Vests and anti-capitalist protesters who are likely to be violent may join the union marches across the city. So even for people who are not on strike today, getting to work is a huge struggle, and I've spoken to many people who've resorted to bikes or who are simply walking. Hospitals are open, but all but non-urgent operations have been cancelled, and many schools are also closed, and a lot of shops have decided just to shut for the day to avoid possible damage if those protests do turn violent.
What's the public's appetite for these strikes, David? Because despite the level of disruption that you've just laid out there, it seems to be the public are largely behind this action.
Well, that's right, Rosie. If you believe the opinion polls, it would seem that about 6 out of 10 French people do support the strikes. But there's a paradox here, because the same opinion polls also show that 3/4 of French people accept that it is necessary to reform France's complicated pension system and to streamline it. What President Macron essentially wants to do is to scrap the country's 42 different pension systems and harmonise them, bring them into one uniform system. So it is a paradox. I've spoken to an economist and a sociologist about this, and they explain it by saying, well, the French support the reforms with their heads, but with their hearts, they're still backing the strikes. So difficult perhaps to grasp, but for now, the strikes do enjoy a very high degree of public support.
The last strike of this size in France actually paid dividends. It caused the government to backtrack. What has the president and the government said about the industrial action and the workers walking out today?
Well, everyone is mindful of what happened 24 years ago to the day when huge strikes and demonstrations against an earlier attempt to reform the pension system began. Now, what happened then was millions of people took to the streets, and the government, headed by a Conservative President Jacques Chirac, backed down and the reforms were stopped. Now, since then, no president until Mr. Macron has dared to touch this explosive issue of pension reform, but the president is now betting that the public mood has changed slightly and people do want economic change, and he has already succeeded in reforming labour laws, and so he's hoping that he's going to be able to drive through the pension reforms. And Mr. Macron and his government ministers have been all over French television, radio, giving interviews to the newspapers, trying to explain to people that they won't lose out, that they will still have decent pensions, but there is a need to reform this system and to stop certain public sector workers from retiring early in their 50s with more generous pensions than those given to private sector workers.